A simple woman in jeans and sneakers walks into an elite dealership and is humiliated by those who judge her by her appearance, but what they don't know is that she holds a power greater than money, quiet strength, immeasurable impact, and a heart determined to open eyes, not seek revenge. Through humility, dignity, and grace, Hannah Whitmore teaches an unforgettable lesson. True wealth isn't what you wear or what you drive. It's how you see and treat others. It started with a doorway, a simple glass entrance, polished to a blinding sheen, reflecting back the world outside, a world that rarely made room for people like her. Hannah Whitmore hesitated only briefly before stepping inside Sutton Elite Motors, the sharp click of her worn sneakers muted by the thick marble floors. She carried no designer purse, no glittering jewelry caught the morning light, just a soft grey sweater, jeans faded by honest use, and the steady, unshakable posture of someone who had long since made peace with who she was. Behind expansive glass walls gleamed a glittering parade of machines, Bentleys, McLarens, Ferraris. Each one whispered of extravagance, of a life curated in penthouses and stitched together with private jets. A low hum of conversation fell to a hush as she crossed the threshold. A man by the reception desk, tailored in navy, smelling faintly of cologne and confidence, turned. His name was Ethan Carter, sales director, self-proclaimed gatekeeper of luxury dreams. He looked her up and down once, and that was enough. The smile that curled on his lips wasn't a greeting, it was a warning. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice a careful cocktail of boredom and disdain, "but I think you're in the wrong place." Several heads lifted, curious. He gestured, almost lazily, toward the shining glass doors behind her. "These vehicles start at $350,000, he added, just loud enough for nearby staff and customers to hear. Someone chuckled behind a manicured hand. Hannah felt a heat rising in her cheeks, not the fierce burn of shame, but the colder, heavier flush of familiarity. She'd seen this look before, the eyes that decided worth in an instant. Jeans, sweater, scuffed sneakers, therefore invisible, unworthy, irrelevant. She smiled softly, a smile Ethan mistook for confusion, and turned without a word. The marble floor seemed to stretch endlessly before her as she crossed it alone, her footsteps swallowed by the cavernous quiet. Outside, the autumn sunlight painted the street gold, indifferent to the small, unseen heartbreak unfolding at the luxury dealership's doorstep. Behind the glass, the laughter resumed. Ethan, triumphant in a victory he didn't yet know was hollow, dusted invisible lint from his sleeve and returned to his conversation. Across town, in a quiet sun-drenched office, the phone on Alexander Whitmore's desk buzzed. He glanced at the screen and immediately set down his papers. Hannah. 15 years of marriage had taught him that there were certain calls you answered without hesitation, no matter the meeting, no matter the hour. He answered, and after only 3 words from her, it happened again. He knew. He could hear it in the tightness of her voice, the silence between syllables that was louder than words. Alexander didn't press. He let her tell it in her own way, the way the sales director had sneered, the dismissive glance, the way the showroom had collectively decided she didn't belong. He listened to it all, without interruption. Not anger, not yet, but something deeper stirred in him, a bone-deep sorrow that no amount of money, no number of foundations founded, no empires built could shield the woman he loved from small, shallow minds. When she finished, he asked, his voice measured, "What do you want to do?" There was a pause. Then, a small, weary laugh. "I don't want revenge," she said. "Not for me." And he believed her. Hannah Whitmore, the woman who had built schools and clinics and safe havens across the country, had always fought for more than herself. Another pause. Longer this time. "I want them to see Alexander leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, a plan already beginning to take form behind his thoughtful, storm-grey eyes. He smiled, not unkindly, into the silence. "Then," he said gently, "let's make sure they do." The next morning would arrive with the promise of revelation, but tonight belonged to quiet resolve. Hannah closed her eyes against the fading daylight, breathing in the familiar scent of cedarwood and paper in Alexander's office, grounding herself. She had long ago learned that dignity isn't forged in grand moments, but in small ones. The choice to walk away, to rise without spectacle, to let the world think it had won when you knew better. Tomorrow, she wouldn't need a speech, or anger, or retribution. Tomorrow, she would need only one thing: the truth. And the truth, when it finally walked through the glass doors of Sutton Elite Motors, would be impossible to ignore. Hannah Whitmore had always been good at vanishing. Not physically, she was tall enough, striking enough, to stand out when she wanted to. But in a world obsessed with labels and appearances, it was easy to become invisible when you wore none of their armor. No diamond rings flashed on her fingers. No designer logos screamed from her handbag. No carefully curated Instagram posts announced her every step. And that, perhaps, was her greatest freedom. Behind the modest exterior, however, lived a story that few people would have dared to imagine. Long before Alexander Whitmore entered her life, long before her last name became one whispered in boardrooms and printed in Forbes profiles, Hannah had built something extraordinary, with nothing more than conviction and grit. The Whitmore Foundation for Special Youth was born from a battered second-hand desk and a library filled with borrowed books. At 24, fresh from a degree in special needs education and a heart that refused to be disillusioned, she had seen a gap that others ignored. Children with physical disabilities who were slipping through society's cracks, who were told with a polite smile that their dreams should be smaller, more realistic. Hannah had refused to accept that. She had worked through endless nights, scribbling grant applications by hand, pounding the pavement to raise funds, lobbying schools and hospitals to create real programs, real chances. By 30, the Whitmore Foundation had raised over $20 million. By 35, the number had doubled. Wheelchairs were no longer barriers. They were battle chariots. Prosthetics weren't chains. They were passports to possibilities. And every single child who crossed a finish line, every scholarship awarded, every new playground adapted for all abilities, each one was a silent rebellion against the narrow vision the world had for them. Hannah had done that, without fanfare, without spotlights, without ever asking for recognition, which is why it stung, even now, even after all these years, when a man like Ethan Carter could glance at her sweater and sneakers and decide she was nobody. It wasn't the insult itself that hurt. It was knowing how many others, without her resources or resilience, would have been crushed by it. And that, Hannah decided as she watched the sunset over the Whitmore estate, was reason enough to act, not for herself, for them. The Whitmore estate sat quietly on 6 acres, just outside Chicago. Not a mansion of gaudy gold and marble, but a graceful old colonial with white pillars and ivy creeping up its sides. Inside, it felt less like a billionaire's lair and more like a home. Worn oak floors, sun, faded curtains, family photos on the mantel, not of galas and yacht parties, but of hospital fundraisers and field days. This was who they were. This was who she fought for. As she moved through the house, preparing for the next day's quiet reckoning, her steps slowed in front of a framed photo near the staircase. A small boy, no older than 6, his right leg ending just above the knee, racing across a soccer field in a custom-built running blade, his face lit with pure, unfiltered joy. Nate, her little brother, her miracle. The car she had tried to buy yesterday, the one Ethan had guarded like a dragon sitting atop a pile of gold, wasn't for herself, it was for Nate. After battling leukemia through his teenage years and surviving an amputation that would have broken lesser spirits, Nate had made it through. This year, on his 30th birthday, he would finally graduate with a degree in mechanical engineering, a dream fueled, in part, by the very prosthetic innovations Hannah had spent her life helping to fund. And so, when she had spotted the jet black Aston Martin, she hadn't seen just a car. She had seen Nate's joy. She had seen a moment where the world, just for once, would tell him, "You are not limited. You are unstoppable." Hannah ran a hand lightly over the photo frame, a quiet promise forming between her fingers. He would have that car, he would have that dream, not because of pity, not because of charity, but because he had earned it, and because no one, least of all an Ethan Carter, would ever tell her otherwise. Upstairs, Alexander Whitmore finished the last of his evening calls. His empire stretched quietly behind the scenes of daily life, renewable energy grids that powered cities, medical tech startups that saved lives. But tonight, none of that mattered as much as the woman he had promised to love, honor, and fight for. When Hannah entered the study, he closed his laptop without hesitation. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" he asked gently, reading her face the way only he could. "I'm sure," she said simply. No anger, no resentment, only that rare, immovable thing that made Hannah who she was. Purpose. Alexander smiled faintly, rising to cross the room and press a kiss to her forehead. "Then let's remind them," he murmured, "that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones they never even see coming." Far across the city, Sutton Elite Motors closed for the night. The floors were buffed to a mirror shine. The glass walls glowed faintly under security lights. Inside, Ethan Carter leaned against a counter, regaling two colleagues with the amusing story of the woman in jeans who thought she could buy an Aston Martin. They laughed, the hollow, brittle laughter of those who mistook their borrowed status for true power. They laughed, not realizing that by morning, the joke would no longer be theirs to tell. They laughed, never once wondering who she might really be. The morning light cut across the Whitmore estate like a blade, illuminating the edges of a world that moved not with noise, but with quiet, deliberate power. At the long oak breakfast table, Hannah sipped her coffee slowly, her mind already elsewhere. Alexander sat opposite her, one hand resting loosely around a ceramic mug, the other scrolling through his phone, not for emails or stock alerts, but for contacts, specific contacts, people who, when called upon, could orchestrate change not with headlines, but with gestures too subtle for the untrained eye to see. They had agreed, no theatrics, no lawsuits, no viral videos, no humiliating exposes that would only turn Sutton Elite Motors into another cautionary tale, chewed up by the 24-hour news cycle. They didn't want Sutton's staff to be destroyed. They wanted them to understand. The difference was everything. "Have you spoken to Marcus?" Hannah asked, setting her cup down carefully. Alexander nodded. "He's sending the Phantom first thing. Midnight black, extended bass, fully bespoke." Hannah gave a small smile. There was something poetic about it, arriving in a vehicle rarer than anything Ethan Carter had ever laid hands on. An unspoken reminder that true luxury didn't advertise itself. It simply existed. "And the driver?" she asked. "Uniformed, discreet. Not a word out of place." She nodded approvingly. There would be no entourage, no flashy security details stepping out first to clear the way. Only Alexander himself, one man, impeccably dressed, stepping quietly into the world that had turned his wife away without a second thought. "Do you want to come with me?" Alexander asked, watching her over the rim of his cup. Hannah hesitated. Part of her wanted to. Part of her longed to stand at his side and meet their shock head-on. But that wasn't the point, was it? This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about personal satisfaction. It was about creating a moment of recognition, a mirror held up to their assumptions, polished so bright they couldn't look away. She shook her head gently. "This isn't about me needing to watch them squirm," he smiled, something fond and fierce flickering across his features. "Of course not," he said. "You want them to understand, to really understand." She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "And besides," she added, a twinkle returning to her eye, "you'll give me a full report after, won't you?" Alexander chuckled, a low, warm sound. "Every detail," he promised. Outside, the groundskeeper started the leaf blower, sending a scatter of golden autumn leaves dancing across the lawn. It was a new day, and by its end, the men who had laughed behind polished glass walls would understand that worth was never draped in silk or stitched into handbags. It lived in the marrow of people like Hannah Whitmore. Across town, Sutton Elite Motors woke to another normal morning. The showroom gleamed under fluorescent lights. Rows of glistening cars lined up like soldiers awaiting inspection. Ethan Carter arrived early, as usual, taking a moment to adjust his tie in the mirrored elevator. The memory of yesterday's incident, the woman in the sweater and jeans, still floated in his mind, but only as an amusing anecdote. He had recounted it to his colleagues over scotch last night, earning laughs and headshakes. "Some people," one of them had said, swirling a glass, "just don't get it," Ethan agreed. People who belonged at Sutton didn't need to convince anyone they could afford it. Their shoes, their watches, their very posture announced it before they even spoke. It wasn't elitism, he told himself. It was simply reality. He adjusted his jacket cuffs, smoothed his hair back. Time to get back to it. The sales team gathered for the morning meeting. Standing in a semicircle around the main reception area, Ethan, clipboard in hand, addressed them like a general preparing troops for battle. "Remember," he said, his voice firm but polished, "qualifying customers isn't just good business. It's necessary. Our time and our inventory is too valuable to waste." A few of the younger sales associates nodded eagerly. Only one face remained uncertain. Jordan, the junior salesman who had offered Hannah help yesterday. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, but said nothing. Ethan noted the hesitation and mentally filed it away for later. A quiet conversation, perhaps, about professional standards. The meeting ended with a reminder about upcoming promotions and the high-profile clients expected later that afternoon. Ethan felt the familiar adrenaline buzz. Another day of deals, another day proving he could spot wealth before the first word was even spoken. He didn't know it yet, but today would cost him far more than he could imagine. At precisely 10:17 a.m., the room changed. It happened subtly at first, a collective slowing of movements, conversations trailing off mid-sentence. Heads turned toward the vast glass entryway, where a vehicle now purred quietly at the curb. Not just any vehicle, a Rolls-Royce Cullinan, custom-built, midnight black. Its polished chrome trim caught the morning light, dazzling the eye. The showroom, so often a cacophony of chatter and bravado, fell completely silent. Even Ethan, jaded by years of proximity to luxury, felt his breath catch for a half-second. This was different. This was the real thing. The kind of client dealerships like Sutton dreamt of, not a customer, but a patron. A uniformed chauffeur stepped out first. His white gloves pristine, he moved with precision to open the rear door, and from the shadows of the vehicle emerged a man who didn't need to announce himself. Tall, lay, impeccably tailored in a charcoal suit that whispered bespoke craftsmanship, silver-streaked hair, perfectly groomed, a bearing that spoke of old money, new empires, and power so deep it didn't need to shout. Alexander Whitmore. Ethan was already moving before he realized it, his instincts pulling him forward with the desperate grace of a moth to a flame. "Good morning, sir," he called out, flashing his most polished smile. "Welcome to Sutton Elite Motors. I'm Ethan Carter, Sales Director. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today." Alexander paused for a fraction of a second, just enough to let the silence stretch, before extending a hand. "Alexander Whitmore," he said simply. Ethan's mind whirred. Whitmore. The name tickled something at the edges of his memory, but he couldn't place it. It didn't matter. What mattered was that a man like this had walked through their doors, and Ethan was going to be the one to close the sale of the decade. He didn't know, as he led Alexander deeper into the gleaming jungle of steel and glass, that the foundations of his world were already beginning to crack. He didn't know that this man, this quiet, unassuming storm, hadn't come to buy. He had come to change everything, and before the day was out, Ethan Carter would no longer see the world, or himself, the same way ever again. Alexander Whitmore moved through the Sutton Elite Motors showroom like a ghost from a finer world, his steps slow, deliberate, unhurried. The polished marble beneath his shoes barely seemed to notice his weight. Every car gleamed for him. Every surface reflected him. Yet it was not vanity that walked beside him. It was certainty. Ethan Carter hovered at his side, a half step behind, vibrating with thinly disguised eagerness. "We have an exceptional collection, Mr. Whitmore," Ethan said, pitching his voice just above a reverent whisper. "Our newest arrivals include the McLaren Artura, the limited Bentley Baccarat, and—" "I'm interested," Alexander interrupted quietly. "In a very specific model." Ethan snapped to attention, all smiles and readiness. "Of course, sir. Anything at all. Just say the word." Alexander let his gaze drift lazily across the rows of polished steel and velvet ropes, as if considering, as if weighing something deeper than horsepower or carbon fiber. "The Aston Martin DBS. Superleggera," he said at last. "Jet black. I believe you have one here." Ethan nearly stumbled in his excitement. An Aston purchase would be prestigious enough. A man arriving in a bespoke Rolls-Royce to inquire about one? That was the kind of transaction careers were built on. "Yes, sir." "Right this way," Ethan motioned grandly, leading Alexander toward the raised platform where the car gleamed under a halo of soft lights. As they walked, heads turned, salespeople paused, mid-sentence. Customers peered over their shoulders. No one knew yet why the air had changed, why the temperature in the room had shifted, but they felt it. Some presences could not be ignored. They rearranged gravity itself. When they reached the platform, Ethan turned with a flourish. "There she is. Only 15, made this year. Extremely exclusive. Reserved for a very particular kind of client." Alexander said nothing. He simply regarded the vehicle, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his face unreadable. It was Ethan who cracked first, rushing to fill the silence. "If you'd like, sir, I can arrange a private viewing room. Champagne, perhaps. We could have the car brought around front for—" Alexander raised a hand, halting the words mid-spill. "There's something you should know first," he said. Ethan straightened, sensing something, but not understanding yet. "My wife was here yesterday," Alexander continued, his voice calm as ever, but with an undertone now. "The faint rumble before a storm breaks." Ethan's smile faltered. Was she?" he said, laughing lightly. "Wonderful. I hope she received excellent service." "Who assisted her?" "You did," Alexander said, his gaze pinning him to the spot. The words landed with the precision of a scalpel. "You," Alexander repeated softly. "Greeted her. You dismissed her. You suggested she visit the used car lot down the street." The blood drained from Ethan's face so fast it left him visibly pale. Behind them, Jordan, the young salesman who had tried to help Hannah, stood frozen at the periphery, mouth slightly open, A few customers had turned to listen. One of the receptionists, pretending to organize brochures, glanced up sharply. Aye, Ethan stammered. He tried to summon his usual charm, but it slipped from his fingers like water. Miss Whitmore, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. We pride ourselves on. Alexander cut him off with a slight tilt of his head. A gesture so small yet so commanding it snapped Ethan's mouth shut. There was no misunderstanding, Alexander said, his voice low and heavy with quiet authority. You saw a woman in jeans and a sweater. You judged her unworthy of your time. You humiliated her publicly in front of your staff and customers. Ethan's hands twitched at his sides, desperate for somewhere to hide. And the irony, Alexander continued, almost gently, is that she could have bought this dealership outright if she wished, but she doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. The silence around them was suffocating now. Even Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, had emerged from his glass-walled office, sensing something seismic unfolding. Is there a problem here? Richard asked cautiously. Alexander turned to face him. No problem, he said smoothly. Simply a learning opportunity. Richard smiled thinly. Of course. We deeply value every guest, and I'm sure any lapse in service was completely unintentional. The cowardice was almost too easy. Alexander regarded him for a long, unblinking moment. My wife's name is Hannah Whitmore, he said, founder of the Whitmore Foundation, advocate, philanthropist, educator. She came here yesterday to purchase this vehicle, cash, as a gift for her brother, a leukemia survivor. A ripple of whispers spread like wildfire through the showroom. Hannah Whitmore. The name clicked in brains one after another. Prestige, wealth, influence. The kind of name that closed cities for charity galas and built hospitals where none had stood before. And they had thrown her out, like she was nothing. Ethan opened his mouth, desperate to salvage something, anything. But Alexander silenced him with a single look. I don't require apologies, he said. I'm not here for retribution. He let that settle before delivering the final blow. But understand this. True value is invisible. It doesn't announce itself in silk suits or 6-inch heels. It lives in integrity, in compassion, in the ability to treat every soul with dignity, not just the ones you think can do something for you. For a long, breathless second, no one moved. The truth of it hung in the air, heavier than any luxury vehicle in the showroom. Behind Alexander, Jordan, the junior salesman, stepped forward, voice shaking slightly. Miss Whitmore was incredibly kind, he said. She was clear about what she wanted. She didn't deserve the way she was treated. Ethan glared at him, but it was too late. The floodgate was open. The truth had slipped out. Alexander turned back to the Superleggera, running his fingertips lightly along the sleek carbon fiber hood. My wife wanted this car for her brother, he said thoughtfully. And she'll still have it. He turned to Jordan. You, he said simply, you'll handle the sale. Jordan's eyes widened, stunned. Me, sir. Yes. You showed respect when no one else did. That matters more than 1,000 polished smiles. Jordan swallowed hard, nodding. Thank you. I'll make sure everything is perfect. Alexander nodded once, firmly. And as for you, he said, turning back to Ethan, you'll have an opportunity too. Ethan straightened hopefully, grasping for a lifeline. You'll have a chance to volunteer, Alexander continued, at the Whitmore Foundation's annual gala, working directly with the children you were too busy to see yesterday. The words hit like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Not punishment, perspective. A second chance to understand what mattered, if he was smart enough to take it. And with that, Alexander Whitmore turned and walked toward the reception desk, leaving Ethan Carter standing among the ruins of his pride, surrounded by a showroom that suddenly felt too bright, too polished, too hollow. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt very, very small. The air inside Sutton Elite Motors was different now, brittle, almost painful. No one spoke as Alexander Whitmore crossed the gleaming floor with the quiet authority of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command the room. Behind him, Ethan Carter remained frozen, the realization of what he had done pressing against his chest, like a weight he couldn't shake off. Richard Mason hurried to catch up, his leather shoes squeaking faintly against the floor. "Mr. Whitmore," he began, his tone overly warm, "please allow me to personally assure you that this dealership does not condone discrimination in any form." Alexander turned to him, his grey eyes cool and unblinking. "Actions," he said simply, "speak louder than policies printed on brochures." Richard swallowed hard. Across the room, a handful of customers pretended to browse, but couldn't hide their stolen glances. Staff members stood rigid behind reception desks, pretending not to listen. The spectacle was no longer ignorable. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was an indictment. Jordan, the young salesman who had dared to speak the truth, stood awkwardly a few paces back, torn between pride and fear. Alexander caught his eye and gave the faintest nod, the kind of gesture that said, "You did the right thing," the kind of gesture that could save a young man's sense of decency in a world that often punished it. Ethan finally moved. He approached carefully, hands slightly raised, like a man approaching a wild animal. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice strained but trying for smoothness, "I deeply regret if there was any misunderstanding with your wife." Alexander turned to him fully now. "There was no misunderstanding," he said calmly. "You judged her publicly, repeatedly, and you taught everyone under your influence that it was acceptable." Ethan opened his mouth, closed it again. There was no defense. There was only the truth, naked, ugly, and searing under the fluorescent lights. Alexander shifted his attention back to Richard. "Now, Miss Mason," he said, his voice even. "Regarding the vehicles." Richard seized the opportunity, like a drowning man grabbing a lifeboat. Of course, sir. We'd be honored to assist you with your purchase. Whatever you need." Alexander's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something far sharper. "I was planning," he said slowly, "to purchase the Aston Martin for my wife's brother." He paused deliberately, and additionally, to replace my company's fleet. 7 vehicles in total, along with an expansion of my personal collection. A collective breath was drawn around the room, the kind of transaction that could have set the dealership's sales record for the entire quarter. Richard's face lit up like Christmas morning. "But," Alexander continued, voice still soft but deadly, "I now find myself questioning whether this establishment deserves that level of business." It was a masterstroke, slow, devastating, and entirely without anger. Pure, surgical consequence. Richard stumbled over his own eagerness. "Please, sir, allow us to make this right. We value your business deeply." Alexander considered him for a long moment, then said, "Perhaps there's a path forward." Hope flared in Richard's eyes. "Anything," he promised. Alexander glanced toward Ethan, who paled visibly under the weight of the unspoken future hanging over him. "The Whitmore Foundation is hosting a benefit gala next month," Alexander said. "We're raising funds for a new adaptive sports complex, a project near to my wife's heart." He turned his gaze back to Ethan. "We're always in need of volunteers. Real work. No headlines, no photo ops. Just humility and service." Ethan swallowed so hard the sound seemed to echo. "Of course," Richard jumped in quickly. "We'll send a team. Whatever you require." "No," Alexander said quietly. "Ethan will come. Personally." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard nodded furiously. "Of course." Absolutely, Ethan, cornered like an animal, simply dipped his head in a jerky nod. Anything to make the nightmare end. Alexander regarded him for a moment longer, not with cruelty, but with something that cut even deeper, disappointment. Then he turned to Jordan. "You," he said, "will process the sale of the Aston Martin." Jordan blinked, stunned. "Me, sir. You respected my wife when others didn't." "That matters more than 1,000 suits and titles." Jordan nodded, his throat too tight for words. As Alexander followed him toward the sales office, he paused by the Aston Martin. The jet-black body gleamed under the lights. Sleek, powerful, unstoppable. He rested a hand lightly on the hood, almost reverently. "My wife," he said softly, "has excellent taste." Behind him, Ethan Carter stood in the center of the showroom, still and small, as the world he thought he controlled crumbled around him. The difference was clear now to everyone. Real power does not demand attention. It commands respect, simply by existing. Outside, the sun had shifted, casting long golden rays across the asphalt. The Cullinan waited silently at the curb, a shadow among lesser vehicles. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter, one of redemption for those brave enough to seize it, and for those who weren't, oblivion. Later that afternoon, the atmosphere inside Sutton Elite Motors was as thick and heavy as a brewing storm. The luxury cars gleamed untouched, and conversations were hushed. The entire staff seemed to move more carefully now, as if even the walls had begun to listen. In Richard Mason's office, a sleek glass box overlooking the showroom, Ethan Carter sat stiffly across from his boss. His usual polished demeanor was gone. In its place, a hollow-eyed man, clinging desperately to the crumbling ruins of his pride. Richard stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching as Jordan finalized the sale with Alexander Whitmore downstairs. It should have been his sale. It should have been his commission, his glory. Instead, it was a public coronation for the junior salesman he had once dismissed as too green to handle elite clients. Ethan had never known humiliation like this. "Do you have any idea," Richard said finally, his voice cold, "what you almost cost us?" Ethan swallowed, choosing his words with care. "I understand, sir." "And I?" "No," Richard interrupted sharply. "You don't understand. Not yet." He turned to face him fully. "Alexander Whitmore doesn't just write checks. He rewrites the fate of businesses. He could have bought half this company if he wanted, and you nearly sent him and all his future business walking." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I made a mistake," he said. "I'll fix it." Richard arched an eyebrow. "Will you?" Silence stretched between them. "You'll attend the Whitmore Foundation event," Richard continued. "You'll do exactly as Miss Whitmore instructed, and after that?" Ethan asked, voice tight. Richard gave a humorless smile. "That depends on how well you learn." Across town, in a warmly lit kitchen fragrant with cinnamon and coffee, Hannah Whitmore leaned against the counter, phone pressed to her ear. Alexander's voice poured through the speaker, calm and deliberate. Recounting every detail of the morning, she closed her eyes, picturing it. The silent showroom, the stunned faces, the moment truth peeled away the glittering veneers, and yet she felt no triumph, only a quiet, aching hope that maybe, just maybe, those who had laughed at her would see themselves clearly now and change. Meanwhile, at the Whitmore Foundation's headquarters, preparations for the annual gala had kicked into high gear. Volunteers bustled through the halls, hanging banners and assembling welcome packets. Children in wheelchairs raced each other down freshly waxed hallways, their laughter ringing like bells. This was what mattered. This, not car prices or Italian shoes, was where the future lived, and soon Sutton Elite Motors' most prideful employee would walk into this world, not as a VIP, not as a guest, but as a helper, an apprentice to humanity itself. 3 days later, on a bright Saturday morning, Ethan Carter stood awkwardly near the entrance of the Boston Grand Hotel, wearing a plain navy staff polo and black slacks. Gone were the tailored suits. Gone was the heavy gold watch. Gone was the protective armor of status. In its place, vulnerability. The volunteer coordinator, a brisk woman named Yasmin, handed him a clipboard without ceremony. "You're assigned to the children's activities section," she said, glancing at his name tag. "Room 4B. Go. No special treatment. No whispered, deferential greetings." He was, for the first time in years, just another pair of hands, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Inside room 4B, colourful mats and obstacle courses had been laid out for the adaptive sports program. Basketballs, soccer balls, modified scooters. Every inch of the room buzzed with energy and anticipation. Dozens of children, many with visible physical disabilities, wheeled and ran and stumbled and laughed with wild abandon. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling utterly out of place. He didn't know where to look. He didn't know where to begin. And then a voice cut through his paralysis. "You're going to stand there all day, mister?" A small boy in a red wheelchair grinned up at him, dribbling a basketball expertly with one hand. Ethan blinked. The boy grinned wider. "Keem on. Bet you can't shoot better than me." Without thinking, Ethan stepped onto the court, and for the first time in a long time, the world didn't ask him how expensive his shoes were. It didn't care about his car keys, or his watch, or the labels stitched inside his clothes. The world asked, "Can you show up? Can you care? Can you try?" And maybe, just maybe, he could. By the end of the first hour, Ethan was breathless and sweaty, helping to rebound basketballs, fix twisted straps, and high-five every grinning child who zoomed past him. His crisp corporate polish had dissolved in the tide of giggles and shouts and stubborn, magnificent joy. For the first time in years, he wasn't performing. He was participating, really participating. And somehow, impossibly, it felt better than closing a $1 million deal. When he helped the boy in the red wheelchair, Thomas, line up for a group photo at the end of the session, the child looked up at him thoughtfully. "You're pretty cool for a grown-up," Thomas said seriously. Ethan's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Thanks, buddy," he managed. And he meant it, because somehow, in the few short hours he'd spent on this brightly coloured court, something fundamental inside him had shifted. He no longer wanted to be the slick salesman with the best numbers. He wanted to be the kind of man who earned the compliment of a child who had fought harder to be here than most men fought their entire lives. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted across the city, turning glass skyscrapers into rivers of gold. A new day had begun for Ethan Carter, and this time he wasn't selling dreams. He was learning how to live one. By Sunday morning, Ethan Carter wasn't just tired. He was exhausted, bone deep, soul heavy, tired. The kind that didn't come from physical effort, but from carrying the weight of things you could no longer ignore. He stood at the entrance of the Boston Grand Hotel's grand ballroom, adjusting the simple volunteer badge clipped to his polo shirt. Around him, the final preparations for the Whitmore Foundation's gala buzzed like a hive. Floral arrangements were ferried in by sweating bellhops. Silver serving platters gleamed under crystal chandeliers. Volunteers pinned name tags to their simple black uniforms, and everywhere the unmistakable feeling that something bigger than wealth or prestige was about to happen. Ethan wasn't used to being invisible in a room like this. He wasn't used to being the one holding chairs, refilling water pitchers, adjusting tablecloths. But strangely, for the first time in years, he didn't resent it. He needed this invisibility. He needed to understand what it felt like to be small, to be background, to serve without expectation of reward. And somewhere deep inside, he suspected Hannah Whitmore had known that all along. Thomas, the boy in the red wheelchair, spotted him near the entrance and waved him over with wild enthusiasm. "You're late, dude," he called, grinning. "I'm 5 minutes early," Ethan protested, laughing despite himself. Thomas shrugged dramatically. "Early's late when you're this awesome." Ethan crouched down to eye level. "You ready for the big adaptive basketball demo?" Thomas's grin widened until it threatened to split his face in two. "I was born ready," Ethan smiled, ruffling the boy's hair lightly before pushing his wheelchair toward the staging area. It struck him then, a flash of piercing clarity. This boy, with one leg and a heart 3 sizes too big for his small chest, had fought battles Ethan couldn't begin to fathom. And yet here he was, smiling, teasing, challenging, alive, fully alive. And Ethan? He realized, not without shame, that he had spent years alive in body, but starved in spirit. Maybe today would begin to change that. As the gala officially began, guests began to flood into the ballroom. Not the usual glitterati Ethan was used to schmoozing, but donors, medical professionals, educators, families, real people. People who had fought battles the world didn't see and rarely cared to ask about. The energy in the room was electric, not the brittle buzz of networking, but the warm, humbling glow of genuine connection. From his position near the volunteer coordination table, Ethan watched as Hannah Whitmore entered the ballroom. He recognized her immediately, not by her clothing, which was as understated as ever, a simple navy dress, minimal jewelry, but by the way the room subtly shifted when she arrived. She didn't command attention, she invited it. Heads turned, smiles bloomed, conversations paused respectfully. This was a woman who had built an empire of kindness, and she wore it more gracefully than any crown. At her side walked Alexander Whitmore, equally low-key yet unmistakably powerful, his hand resting lightly on the small of his wife's back. Together, they didn't just look like change, they were change. And Ethan, for the first time, didn't feel envy or resentment watching them. He felt gratitude, because somehow, impossibly, they had allowed him into their orbit, not to punish him, but to awaken him. After the keynote speeches, after the tribute video showcasing the Foundation's work, which left more than a few eyes suspiciously shiny, it was time for the adaptive sports demonstration. Thomas wheeled himself to center stage, basketball tucked under one arm, grinning at the gathered crowd. "And now," he announced into the microphone with the swagger of a born showman, "I'm going to teach a grown-up how to play like a champion." Laughter rippled through the ballroom. "And for my victim," Thomas said dramatically, spinning his chair toward the side, "I choose Miss Carter." The spotlight found Ethan instantly. He froze, and the room burst into genuine applause and laughter. Blushing, Ethan made his way to the center of the ballroom, where Thomas waited with the patience of a king. For the next 10 minutes, the boy coached Ethan through a series of wheelchair basketball drills, passing, dribbling, shooting from a seated position. Ethan was clumsy, slow, embarrassingly bad, and yet he had never felt so alive. Each time he fumbled, Thomas whooped with laughter, and the audience joined in, not mocking, but celebrating the effort itself. By the time Ethan finally sank a wobbly shot into the lowered hoop, the room erupted in cheers. Thomas rolled over, held up a hand, and Ethan high-fived him so hard their hands stung. For once, success wasn't measured in points or prizes, it was measured in heart. Later, as Ethan caught his breath by the refreshment table, a familiar voice spoke behind him. "You learn fast." He turned. Hannah Whitmore stood there, smiling, not with smugness or pity, but with quiet, genuine warmth. "Not fast enough," Ethan said, surprising even himself with his honesty. She studied him for a moment, her head tilting slightly. "And what have you learned?" Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the past week settle fully on his shoulders at last. "That dignity doesn't wear designer clothes," he said quietly. "That wealth isn't measured in dollars or cars. And that respect, real respect, is owed to every human being until they prove they don't deserve it. Not the other way around." Hannah's smile deepened. "Good lessons," she said. "Expensive ones, maybe, but good." Ethan nodded. "I don't regret the cost." And he meant it. Every lost sale, every moment of humiliation, every uncomfortable truth he had been forced to face. It had all been worth it. Across the room, Alexander Whitmore watched the exchange with quiet approval. He turned to Jordan, the young salesman who stood nearby, still slightly in awe of the entire day. "Remember this," Alexander said, his voice low but firm. "Greatness isn't how high you build your walls. It's how wide you open your gates." Jordan nodded solemnly. The lessons had been many today, for everyone. The ballroom of the Boston Grand Hotel shimmered in soft golden light. Music floated gently across the air, a slow, graceful piece played by a live quartet tucked in one corner. The laughter of children, the murmured conversations of donors, and the clink of crystal glasses blended into a warm hum that filled every inch of space. It didn't feel like an event about money. It felt like a celebration of possibility, of second chances. And perhaps, Ethan thought, watching Thomas whiz by in his red wheelchair, laughing, that was the point. Ethan Carter stood near the back of the room, a fresh volunteer badge pinned neatly to his chest. His simple attire blending in with the bustling staff. But he no longer felt invisible, not in the way he used to. He wasn't smaller now, he was simply part of something bigger, something worth belonging to. Hannah Whitmore moved through the room like a quiet star, drawing people to her without effort. She paused to greet children by name, to hug grateful parents, to thank exhausted volunteers with the same sincerity she would show a head of state. She saw people, really saw them. Ethan watched her for a long moment, the weight of understanding settling fully into place inside him. This woman, dismissed so easily days ago for her simple sweater and jeans, carried more power in a single genuine smile than he had in all his years of posturing and handshakes. She had built bridges where others built barriers. She had built futures where others built walls, and he had almost missed it, almost missed the chance to know what real greatness looked like. Alexander Whitmore stood nearby, speaking quietly with a group of donors. His presence, too, was striking, not loud, not ostentatious, but commanding in its steadiness. Together, they were an unstoppable force, not because of wealth, but because of purpose. They wielded kindness like a weapon. They fought battles others pretended not to see, and they won, not by crushing opponents, but by raising others higher. Near the end of the evening, Ethan found himself beside Thomas again, helping the boy adjust his wheelchair for the closing ceremonies. Thomas leaned close, his voice conspiratorial. "You know, Miss Carter," he said, "you're not so bad for a grown-up." Ethan chuckled. "I'll take that as the highest compliment." "You should," Thomas said seriously. "Most grown-ups don't listen." Ethan's smile faded slightly at the truth of it. He had spent so many years talking at people, convincing, persuading, selling, that he had forgotten how to listen, how to see. Maybe it wasn't too late to start. Later, as the final speeches concluded and applause swept the room, Hannah and Alexander approached the gathered volunteers personally, thanking each one by name. When they reached Ethan, he straightened instinctively, heart hammering. Hannah smiled warmly. "Thank you for today," she said simply. Alexander extended a hand. "We hear," he said, "you've become quite the star in the adaptive sports program." Ethan flushed slightly, but shook his hand firmly. "I'm Just following good coaching, he said, nodding toward Thomas. Alexander's lips twitched in a brief, knowing smile. That's where the best leaders come from, he said. From knowing when to follow. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then added, and speaking of leadership, the corporate fleet I mentioned. We're still in the market. Ethan blinked. Aye. He shook his head slightly. Overwhelmed. I'd be honored, Miss Whitmore. Truly. Alexander clapped him on the shoulder, solid and reassuring. Then we'll talk soon. Jordan speaks highly of you. At that, Ethan's eyes burned unexpectedly, not with shame, not with regret, but with something cleaner, hope. Not just for a career, for a different life. As the gala wound down and guests began filtering out into the cool Boston night, Ethan found himself lingering near the entrance, unwilling to leave just yet. He watched as Hannah knelt to hug a little girl with braces on her legs, watched as Alexander crouched to fist bump a boy in a motorized scooter, watched as the night wrapped itself around these small, shining acts of love and left no room for pride or prejudice. And he thought, this is what wealth is meant to build, not palaces, not pedestals, but bridges. Outside, the city glittered under a velvet sky. Inside, something inside Ethan glittered too, faint, fragile, but very real. For the first time in years, he wasn't measuring his worth by the price of his suit or the thickness of his wallet. He was measuring it by the lives he touched, the moments he chose to show up, the dignity he could offer simply by seeing someone as they truly were. It was, he realized, a far richer life, and it was only just beginning. 2 days after the gala, the offices of Sutton Elite Motors were strangely quieter. The air felt less sharp, less frantic. There was no memo announcing the shift, no sudden speeches, just a quiet, undeniable sense that something had changed in the bones of the place. For once, sales figures and luxury add-ons weren't the only things being discussed behind glass doors. Respect was, compassion was, and somewhere at the heart of it was Ethan Carter, a man trying, for the first time in a long time, to become someone better than he had been. The meeting with Alexander Whitmore had been scheduled with surprising informality. No suits, no prepared speeches, just an invitation. Drop by the estate when you're free. We'll talk. And so, on a clear Thursday morning, Ethan found himself pulling up the long gravel drive of the Whitmore estate, a graceful, ivy-draped colonial that radiated warmth instead of intimidation. He sat in his car for a full minute before getting out, not to compose a pitch, not to rehearse a strategy, just to breathe, to be ready to speak from the only place that mattered now, honesty. Alexander met him at the front door with a handshake that was firm but unadorned by theatrics. "Come in," he said simply. Inside, the house smelled of fresh coffee and cedar. No marble statues, no ostentatious art collections, just family photos, books, life. Ethan followed Alexander into a cozy sunroom, where Hannah was seated, her legs tucked underneath her in a comfortable armchair, her mug balanced casually on one knee. She looked up and smiled, the same smile she had worn that day in the ballroom. Kind, steady, unshakably human. It almost undid him. "I wanted to say thank you," Ethan began, voice lower than usual, "for giving me the opportunity to learn." Alexander simply nodded, allowing him to continue. "And I wanted to say," he trailed off, heart hammering, not because the words were hard to find, but because they had to be real. He drew a slow breath. "I'm sorry," he said at last, meeting Hannah's gaze squarely, "not just for what I said, or how I treated you, but for everything. It came from the assumptions, the arrogance, the smallness." The words, once begun, poured out. "I thought I understood success, he said. I thought it was about appearance, about proof. I thought if someone didn't look the part, they didn't deserve the place. He shook his head slightly. I see now that real worth doesn't announce itself. It just is. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Sacred. A space wide enough to fit regret and growth and forgiveness all at once. Hannah set her mug down gently. I accept your apology, she said simply. Not because it's easy, but because you earned it. Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Alexander stepped forward, offering him a seat at the small table. Now, he said, his tone warming, let's talk about the future. They spoke for an hour. About vehicles, yes. The corporate fleet Alexander was still interested in purchasing through Sutton Elite Motors, but more importantly, about people, about rebuilding the culture Ethan had once helped damage, about mentoring the younger sales associates, like Jordan, to see value beyond designer labels and polished exteriors, about starting small changes that could ripple outward into something much larger, not just sales strategies, soul strategies. When Ethan finally stood to leave, Hannah offered him her hand. He took it, humbled. Thank you, he said again, voice thick. For everything. She smiled. Just pay it forward, she said, and he intended to. With every handshake, every greeting, every customer who walked through Sutton's doors, regardless of the shoes they wore or the bags they carried, he would see them, really see them. Because once you've looked into the eyes of dignity, raw, unvarnished dignity, you cannot unsee it, not if you have any soul left at all. Outside, as he walked back to his car, the sun slanted across the lawn, turning the ivy-covered estate into a tapestry of green and gold. Ethan paused before opening his door, feeling something inside him shift again. It wasn't the feeling of a man who had won. It was the feeling of a man who had been saved quietly, completely. And for the first time in a long time, he was grateful, truly grateful. A month later, on a crisp, clear afternoon, Sutton Elite Motors looked different. It wasn't the inventory. The polished Ferraris and Lamborghinis still gleamed under perfect lighting. It wasn't the glass walls or the marble floors. They still shone with the same obsessive care. The change was quieter, deeper. It lived in the way the staff now greeted every visitor, with real attentiveness, not rehearsed smiles. It lived in the way Jordan, the once timid young salesman, now trained new hires, emphasizing respect over assumptions. It lived in the way Ethan Carter moved through the showroom, not hunting for status, but recognizing humanity. Every small change mattered. Every choice stitched a new culture together, thread by thread, and somewhere in the heart of it, the memory of Hannah Whitmore's quiet strength pulsed like a living heartbeat. That afternoon, as a light autumn breeze danced leaves across the sidewalk outside, a young woman entered the dealership. She wore worn sneakers, a faded denim jacket, and carried a battered leather backpack slung casually over one shoulder. Old Ethan might not have even looked twice. New Ethan smiled warmly and walked forward to greet her. "Good afternoon," he said, offering his hand without hesitation. "Welcome to Sutton Elite Motors. What can we help you find today?" The young woman blinked, surprised, then smiled back, the tension easing from her shoulders. "I'm just looking," she said softly. "Take your time," Ethan said. "We're here if you need anything." And he meant it, every word. Meanwhile, across the city, at the Whitmore estate, Hannah and Alexander sat in the sunroom, sipping coffee as golden light poured through the wide windows. Thomas's latest thank you card sat on the table between them, a crayon masterpiece featuring stick figures playing basketball and a gleaming Aston Martin sketched in proud, messy detail. Alexander leaned back, smiling faintly. "You think they've learned?" he asked. Hannah considered this, tilting her head thoughtfully. "Some will," she said. Some won't. She set her mug down, her eyes gentle but unwavering. But the ones who do, they'll build a better world. Alexander nodded. Because they saw you. She shook her head, a small private smile curving her lips. Because, she said, they finally saw themselves. Across the lawn, the afternoon sun bathed the world in soft gold. Change, real change, was like that. Hannah thought. It didn't crash through doors or shout from rooftops. It unfolded quietly, stubbornly, one heart at a time. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it began when someone who thought they knew everything discovered they had only just started to learn. Inside the dealership, Ethan watched as the young woman wandered between gleaming cars, tracing her fingertips lightly along the polished hoods. He didn't rush her. He didn't judge her. He simply waited, patient, present, ready. Because now he understood, true wealth isn't measured by what you drive, or what you wear, or the titles people pin to your name. It's measured by how you treat others, especially when you think no one important is watching, and sometimes, when you least expect it. That small choice can open a door, not just for someone else, but for yourself.